October 12, 1942. Klaus Reinhardt pressed his face closer to the grimy window of the boarding house on Michigan Avenue, his breath fogging the cold glass as dawn broke over Ypsilanti. What he witnessed through his Zeiss binoculars in that moment would haunt him for the rest of his life, not with fear, but with the terrible weight of knowing a truth he could never unsay. The factory sprawling before him, barely 6 months old, was doing something that every calculation, every assessment, every confident prediction from Berlin said was impossible. They were building heavy bombers faster than his homeland could produce bicycles. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Klaus Reinhardt was not supposed to be in Michigan. According to his carefully constructed identity, he was Heinrich Wolff, a metallurgical consultant from Switzerland with impeccable credentials and a thick portfolio of recommendations from neutral industrial firms across Europe. The WWII, Germany's military intelligence service, had spent 18 months building this legend, investing resources that could have equipped an entire infantry company to place one highly trained observer within striking distance of America's emerging war production complex. The investment seemed justified in the spring of 1942. Germany's intelligence apparatus, despite its many failures and internal rivalries, understood one fundamental truth about modern warfare. Industrial capacity would determine the outcome. The nation that could produce more tanks, more aircraft, more ammunition would ultimately prevail, regardless of tactical brilliance or ideological fervor. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the WWII, had personally approved the deployment of 17 operatives to North America with a single mission: assess American industrial capability and identify vulnerabilities. Reinhardt was arguably the most qualified of these agents. Before the war, he had worked as a production engineer at Messerschmitt, contributing to the development of manufacturing processes for the Bf-109 fighter. He understood not just the theory of mass production but its practical challenges, the bottlenecks that emerged when moving from prototype to serial production, the quality control issues that plagued rapid scaling, the skilled labor requirements that couldn't be wished into existence. This expertise made him invaluable for evaluating American claims about their production targets, claims that Berlin dismissed as transparent propaganda designed to discourage German military planners. The numbers coming out of Washington seemed designed to insult German intelligence. President Roosevelt had announced goals that sounded like fantasy: 50,000 aircraft in 1942, doubling to 100,000 in 1943. The Reich Ministry of Aviation had laughed at these projections. Germany, with its sophisticated engineering culture and decade of rearmament experience, had produced approximately 15,000 aircraft in 1941. The notion that the Americans, who had maintained only a token air force through the 1930s, could quadruple German output within 2 years struck experienced aircraft manufacturers as absurd. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring had personally assured Hitler that American production claims represented psychological warfare rather than achievable targets. Americans excel at marketing and exaggeration, he had told the Führer in a meeting Reinhardt later learned about through intelligence summaries. They build automobiles adequately, but aircraft require precision engineering and skilled craftsmanship. These are not qualities associated with American mass production. They will discover that bombers cannot be stamped out like Chevrolets. This assessment seemed reasonable to anyone familiar with aircraft manufacturing in 1940. Building a modern bomber represented one of the most complex manufacturing challenges in human history. The B-24 Liberator, specifically, contained over 1 million individual parts that had to be manufactured to exacting tolerances, assembled in precise sequence, and tested thoroughly before the aircraft could be considered airworthy. Germany's most efficient factories, using skilled workers and proven methods, required approximately 30,000 man-hours to complete a single 4-engine bomber. The notion that Americans could dramatically improve on this benchmark seemed to defy engineering reality. Reinhardt's mission was to document this reality, to provide concrete evidence of the gap between American propaganda and actual capability. The WWII wanted photographs, production figures, quality assessments, and identification of critical supply chain vulnerabilities. They wanted to know which factories were struggling, which materials were scarce, which skilled trades were bottlenecking expansion. This intelligence would inform targeting priorities for U-boat warfare, guide Luftwaffe bombing strategy should German aircraft ever reach American shores, and provide reassurance to German leadership that the industrial competition remained manageable. His insertion into the United States had been surprisingly straightforward. Neutral Switzerland provided cover, and America's intelligence services, while growing rapidly, remained inexperienced and understaffed in early 1942. The FBI focused primarily on sabotage prevention and Japanese-American internment, leaving sophisticated economic espionage largely undetected. Reinhardt had arrived in New York in March, spent 2 months establishing his credentials in Pittsburgh's Steel District, then gradually moved west toward Detroit, following the inevitable trail of any metallurgical consultant interested in automotive manufacturing. Detroit in 1942 hummed with transformation. The city that had revolutionized automobile production was pivoting to war production with bewildering speed. Factories that had stamped out cars were retooling for tanks. Plants that made engines for Fords were adapting their lines for aircraft power plants. The scale of this conversion process impressed Reinhardt despite his skepticism. Whatever else might be said about Americans, they possessed remarkable organizational energy and a willingness to discard existing arrangements when circumstances demanded change. The Willow Run facility, however, represented something different. This was not conversion of existing capacity but creation of entirely new capability, purpose-built for a single objective: mass production of B-24 Liberators at a scale never before attempted. Ford Motor Company, at the government's request, had committed to constructing the largest manufacturing building in history, a single structure covering 67 acres under one roof, designed specifically to transform aircraft production from skilled craft to mechanized process. German intelligence had tracked Willow Run's construction with interest and considerable doubt. The facility's scale seemed to confirm American preference for grandiose gestures over practical engineering. Building a factory larger than necessary wasted resources and created coordination challenges. The German approach emphasized distributed production in smaller, specialized facilities, which offered flexibility and reduced vulnerability to bombing. Concentrating aircraft production in a single massive building struck German planners as strategically foolish and operationally questionable. Initial reports from Willow Run seemed to confirm these doubts. The factory had experienced significant startup problems. Ford's attempt to apply automotive assembly line principles to aircraft production encountered unexpected difficulties. Tolerances required for aircraft structures exceeded automotive standards. Skilled aviation workers resented Ford's hierarchical management style. Supply chain coordination for over 30,000 different parts proved vastly more complex than automotive manufacturing. By mid-1942, Willow Run had produced fewer than 100 aircraft, far below projected capacity. These early struggles reached Berlin through various intelligence channels, reinforcing existing assumptions about American industrial limitations. Ford's hubris, one Abwehr assessment concluded, demonstrates the folly of believing automotive methods can be directly applied to precision aircraft manufacturing. Their famous assembly line works for simple, standardized products. Military aircraft require flexibility and craftsmanship that American mass production cannot provide. Reinhardt had arrived in Ypsilanti in September 1942 expecting to document this failure, to photograph a white elephant factory struggling to justify its enormous cost. His cover story positioned him perfectly. Heinrich Wolff, metallurgical consultant, had been invited by a subcontractor to provide advice on aluminum alloy specifications for structural components. This legitimate business provided access to supplier facilities and plausible reason for interest in Willow Run's operations. What he observed in his first week supported German expectations. The factory operated well below theoretical capacity. Sections of the enormous building remained incomplete. Workers looked uncertain, struggling with unfamiliar procedures. Quality control rejected significant portions of initial production. Management seemed overwhelmed by the complexity of coordinating thousands of workers and millions of parts. Reinhardt's reports to Berlin confirmed that Willow Run, while impressive in scale, remained far from the production miracle American propaganda suggested. Then something changed. Reinhardt couldn't identify the precise moment when transformation began, but by early October, the factory's rhythm had shifted. Components moved more smoothly through production sequences. Workers demonstrated growing confidence with complex procedures. Quality rejection rates declined. Most significantly, the interval between completed aircraft began shrinking in ways that seemed to defy his understanding of manufacturing constraints. On October 10, Reinhardt observed 7 completed B-24s emerge from the final assembly area in a single day. This represented more aircraft than some German factories produced in a month. He rechecked his notes, suspecting observation error, but the count remained consistent. 7 heavy bombers, each weighing 32 tons fully loaded, each capable of carrying 4 tons of explosives across thousands of miles, completed and awaiting test flights. In one day. He drafted a report for Berlin emphasizing that these aircraft might not meet full military specifications, that quality problems surely lurked beneath surface appearances, that sustainable production at this pace seemed unlikely. But doubt gnawed at him. The aircraft looked legitimate. Test pilots flew them without apparent hesitation. Military inspectors signed acceptance documents. Something was happening at Willow Run that his training hadn't prepared him to evaluate. October 12 shattered his remaining certainty. Standing at his observation post at dawn, he watched the factory through the early morning shift change. Thousands of workers streamed through the gates, many of them women, a sight that would have scandalized German factory managers who believed heavy manufacturing required male strength and mechanical aptitude. These women, wearing trousers and carrying lunch pails, walked with purpose toward their stations inside the massive building. As daylight strengthened, Reinhardt focused his binoculars on the facility's western end, where completed aircraft emerged for exterior finishing. What he saw made him lower the binoculars, clean the lenses carefully, then look again to confirm his observation wasn't the product of fatigue or wishful thinking. A B-24 Liberator, complete and painted in olive drab, was being towed from the factory toward the airfield. He noted the time, 6:47 a.m. He maintained his observation, expecting this to be the day's sole completion, perhaps the culmination of several days' final assembly work. At 7:52 a.m., another B-24 emerged. Then another at 9:15 a.m. and another at 10:33 a.m. By the time Reinhardt broke for lunch, 6 aircraft had been completed. 6 heavy bombers, in half a day, from a single factory. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The implications made his hands tremble as he tried to write his observation notes. He forced himself to maintain scientific discipline. Perhaps these aircraft had been completed previously and were only now being moved for administrative reasons. Perhaps they represented a special production push that couldn't be sustained. Perhaps quality had been sacrificed for quantity. He needed more data before drawing conclusions that would challenge everything German intelligence believed about American industrial capability. The afternoon provided that data. Aircraft continued emerging at roughly 90-minute intervals. By the time the day shift ended, Willow Run had produced 11 B-24 Liberators. 11. In a single day. From a factory that German experts had dismissed as an expensive failure just weeks earlier. Reinhardt spent that evening performing calculations, checking his arithmetic repeatedly because the results seemed impossible. If Willow Run maintained this production rate, if the aircraft met military specifications, if quality control wasn't simply waving defective planes through inspection, then this single factory was producing more heavy bombers each month than Germany's entire aircraft industry. One factory, in Michigan, was outproducing the combined efforts of Messerschmitt, Junkers, Heinkel, and Dornier. The numbers grew worse when he considered the broader picture. Willow Run was just one facility. Boeing was producing B-17s in Seattle. Consolidated was building additional B-24s in Texas and California. Douglas was manufacturing attack aircraft and transports. the United States wasn't just matching German production. They were preparing to bury the Reich under an avalanche of material so vast that German industrial capacity, constrained by labor shortages, resource limitations, and Allied bombing, could never hope to compete. He drafted an urgent report for Berlin, then hesitated before encoding it for transmission. The WWII had trained him to provide objective assessments, but they had also made clear that defeatist intelligence was unwelcome. Agents who reported information that contradicted leadership expectations often found their credibility questioned, their observations dismissed as enemy deception or personal failure of nerve. Reinhardt had seen competent officers recalled and reassigned to punishment details for the crime of accurate but unwelcome reporting. More troubling was the possibility that his superiors wouldn't believe him. The production rates he was documenting seemed designed to strain credulity. 11 heavy bombers in one day from a single factory sounded like Allied propaganda, the kind of exaggerated claim that Goebbels would dismiss as transparent psychological warfare. Without photographs and detailed documentation, his report might be filed away as the confused observations of an agent who had been compromised or had lost his nerve. He needed proof that would survive skeptical analysis in Berlin. Over the following weeks, Reinhardt took extraordinary risks to document Willow Run's capability. He photographed the factory from multiple angles, showing the continuous flow of aircraft from assembly areas to completion. He obtained production schedules from a secretary at a supplier firm, documents that revealed Ford's targets and actual performance. He interviewed workers at local bars, piecing together details about the manufacturing process that explained how such impossible production rates had been achieved. What emerged from this investigation was more disturbing than the raw production numbers. Willow Run hadn't succeeded through some revolutionary new technology or secret manufacturing process. Instead, Ford had solved the bomber production challenge through relentless application of mass production principles that Henry Ford had pioneered decades earlier for automobile manufacturing. They had broken the aircraft assembly process into hundreds of simple, repetitive tasks that could be performed by workers with minimal training. They had created specialized tools and jigs that ensured consistent quality without requiring skilled craftsmanship. They had coordinated supply chains with clockwork precision so that parts arrived exactly when needed, eliminating warehouse costs and production delays. Most significant was the realization that this approach could be replicated. Willow Run wasn't a unique facility dependent on irreplaceable expertise or rare resources. It was a template that could be duplicated across America's vast industrial base. If Ford could transform aircraft production into an assembly line process, other companies could learn the same methods. The United States possessed hundreds of factories with the space, equipment, and workforce to adopt similar approaches. German production advantages based on skilled craftsmanship and engineering sophistication were being rendered obsolete by American willingness to mechanize and standardize everything. By November, Willow Run's production had accelerated further. The factory was now completing a B-24 every 63 minutes during peak production periods. Aircraft rolled off the line faster than test pilots could fly them away, creating parking problems at the adjacent airfield. Workers who had struggled with unfamiliar procedures weeks earlier now performed their tasks with mechanical efficiency, their growing expertise allowing production rates that would have seemed impossible even to optimistic American planners. Reinhardt's reports grew increasingly urgent and increasingly bleak in their implications. He documented not just what Willow Run was producing, but what this production represented for Germany's strategic position. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. Even if the Luftwaffe achieved favorable exchange rates in air combat, even if German fighters shot down 3 Allied bombers for every German aircraft lost, the Americans could replace their losses faster than Germany could replace their defenders. Attrition warfare, the brutal calculus that had ground down armies in the First World War, was about to be applied to aerial combat with industrial capacity replacing manpower as the decisive variable. The winter of 1942 transformed Klaus Reinhardt from observer to witness, from intelligence gatherer to bearer of unwelcome truth. Each morning brought fresh evidence that contradicted not just German assumptions about American capability, but fundamental beliefs about how industrial competition between nations functioned. The factory that was supposed to validate European superiority was instead demonstrating that old-world craftsmanship had become strategically irrelevant in the face of mechanized mass production. December brought heavy snow to Michigan, the kind of bitter cold that Reinhardt remembered from winters in Bavaria. He watched from his boarding house window as workers trudged through accumulating drifts toward the factory, thousands of them arriving for each shift regardless of weather conditions. The buses ran continuously, transporting employees from Detroit and surrounding communities. The parking lots filled with cars despite gas rationing. The American workforce, he realized, possessed a reliability that German planners had not accounted for. These were not conscripted laborers working under threat of punishment, but voluntary employees motivated by wages, patriotism, and perhaps simple pride in being part of something unprecedented. Inside Willow Run, the transformation continued. Reinhardt had managed to arrange a legitimate factory tour through his consulting cover, joining a group of engineering students and military procurement officers for a carefully supervised walk through selected production areas. What he observed during those 2 hours forced him to revise every assumption he had brought to America. The assembly line stretched nearly a mile through the building's interior, a continuous flow of aircraft components moving on overhead conveyors and floor-level transfer systems. At the line's beginning, raw aluminum sheets and structural components entered the process. At the far end, complete bombers emerged ready for engine installation and testing. Between these points, thousands of workers performed specialized tasks with mechanical precision, each person responsible for a narrowly defined operation that required minimal training but contributed to the larger whole. What struck Reinhardt most forcefully was the role of women in this process. German factories employed women primarily in light assembly work, jobs considered suitable for female physical capacity and temperament. At Willow Run, women operated rivet guns, assembled hydraulic systems, installed electrical components, and performed quality inspections on critical structural elements. They worked alongside men without apparent distinction, their contributions treated as equivalent rather than supplementary. One woman in particular caught his attention during the tour. She was installing control cables in a bomber's tail section, working suspended on a scaffold inside the fuselage. Her movements showed practiced confidence as she threaded cables through pulleys, adjusted tension, and verified proper operation. When Reinhardt's tour group paused near her workstation, the guide mentioned casually that this woman had been a schoolteacher 6 months earlier. She had completed 3 weeks of training before beginning work on the assembly line. 3 weeks. A schoolteacher with 3 weeks of training was performing work that would have required a multi-year apprenticeship in German aircraft factories. This was not because American standards were lower or quality requirements less stringent. The aircraft emerging from Willow Run were performing successfully in combat across multiple theaters. Rather, Ford had succeeded in redesigning the manufacturing process itself, eliminating the need for traditional skills by creating tools, jigs, and procedures that made complex tasks simple. The implications cascaded through Reinhardt's understanding like dominoes falling in sequence. If aircraft production no longer required years of apprenticeship, then America's vast population became an unlimited source of potential aircraft workers. If training required only weeks rather than years, then production could scale almost infinitely as long as factory space and raw materials remained available. If quality could be ensured through process design rather than craftsman skill, then consistency would improve rather than degrade as production accelerated. Germany's advantages in this competition were evaporating under examination. Yes, German engineers possessed superior theoretical knowledge. Yes, German craftsmen had inherited generations of manufacturing tradition. Yes, German aircraft often incorporated innovative design features and meticulous attention to detail. But none of these advantages mattered if the enemy could produce 10 aircraft for every one rolling out of German factories, if American bombers could be replaced faster than they could be shot down, if the sheer weight of numerical superiority rendered quality differentials strategically meaningless. After the factory tour, Reinhardt requested a meeting with a Ford production manager, claiming interest in aluminum fabrication techniques for his consulting practice. The manager, proud of Willow Run's achievements and eager to discuss their innovations, provided details that Reinhardt knew Berlin would find difficult to accept. The factory was still accelerating production. Current output of one bomber per 63 minutes represented a transitional benchmark rather than maximum capability. Ford engineers were implementing additional refinements that would reduce cycle time further. The limiting factor was no longer manufacturing efficiency but the capacity of the adjacent airfield to handle completed aircraft. Ford was negotiating with the Army Air Forces to establish additional delivery points because Willow Run was producing bombers faster than they could be flown away for deployment. The manager mentioned almost casually that Willow Run employed over 40,000 workers and could expand to 50,000 if production targets required additional labor. 40,000 workers in a single factory. This was more than the total workforce of Germany's three largest aircraft manufacturers combined. The scale of American industrial mobilization was rendering European concepts of military production obsolete. Reinhardt asked about quality control, probing for weaknesses that might offset the production quantity advantages. The manager acknowledged early struggles with defect rates in military specification compliance, but explained how systematic process improvements had addressed these issues. Current rejection rates ran below 5%, comparable to or better than traditional aircraft manufacturing methods. More significantly, the standardization inherent in assembly line production meant that parts were truly interchangeable, that repairs and modifications could be performed efficiently in field conditions, that the logistics of maintaining thousands of aircraft became manageable in ways that German maintenance systems, dependent on skilled mechanics adapting to unique characteristics of hand-built aircraft, could never achieve. That evening, Reinhardt encoded his most comprehensive report yet, a detailed assessment that would reach Berlin through complex routing via Mexico and neutral Argentina. He documented production rates with supporting evidence, described the manufacturing process innovations that enabled such output, analyzed the workforce characteristics that made rapid scaling possible, and provided his professional judgment on the strategic implications. The conclusions he reached were devastating for German military planning. Willow Run alone would produce more than 4,000 B-24 bombers in 1943 if current trends continued. Combined with other American aircraft factories operating on similar principles, the United States would achieve Roosevelt's seemingly impossible production targets. Germany would face not thousands but tens of thousands of enemy aircraft, wave after wave of bombers that could be replaced faster than they could be destroyed, escorted by fighters produced in even greater numbers at other facilities applying the same mass production methods. More ominously, the same principles transforming aircraft production were being applied across America's industrial base. Tank production, artillery manufacturing, ammunition production, shipbuilding, all were being mechanized and scaled using assembly line methods. The United States was converting its enormous peacetime manufacturing capacity to war production with a speed that defied German assumptions about democratic inefficiency and capitalist disorganization. Reinhardt waited 3 weeks for Berlin's response to his reports. When the reply finally arrived through dead-drop communication, the message was brief and pointed. His superiors acknowledged his information but questioned whether he had been deceived by American propaganda efforts. They noted that photographic evidence could be staged, that production schedules might reflect aspirational targets rather than actual output, that informants might be spreading deliberate misinformation. They instructed him to verify his observations through independent sources and to maintain skepticism about claims that seemed designed to demoralize German intelligence services. The response revealed everything Reinhardt had feared. Berlin didn't want accurate intelligence. They wanted confirmation of existing beliefs. Information that challenged leadership assumptions was treated as enemy deception rather than valuable warning. The institutional culture that had enabled Germany's initial military successes had become a liability, a system that filtered unwelcome information and reinforced comforting illusions. He continued his surveillance through the winter, documenting production with obsessive precision, knowing that his reports were likely being discounted or ignored. By February 1943, Willow Run was producing over 100 B-24s monthly. By March, production exceeded 150 aircraft. The factory had become a marvel of industrial efficiency, a system so refined that problems requiring days to resolve in September could be addressed in hours by spring. Reinhardt observed that American military officers visited the factory regularly, often bringing delegations from Allied nations to witness the production capability firsthand. British officials toured the facility, undoubtedly comparing what they saw to their own aircraft production systems. Soviet representatives attended as well, their presence a reminder that American industrial might was being shared with allies, that the Lend-Lease program was extending American production advantages across the entire Allied coalition. In March, Reinhardt's contact network reported that Ford was planning to establish additional production facilities for other aircraft types, that lessons learned at Willow Run were being systematized and shared across the American aviation industry, that what had seemed like a unique achievement was actually a template for transforming military production throughout the United States. The implications were staggering. If this template could be replicated, if other industries could achieve similar efficiency gains, then America's industrial mobilization had barely begun. The flood of war materials arriving in Europe and the Pacific represented not peak production but early output from systems still gaining efficiency. One evening in late March, Reinhardt sat in his boarding house room with his notebooks spread across the desk, reviewing months of observations and attempting to synthesize conclusions that Berlin might find credible. The data was overwhelming and unambiguous. America had solved the production problem that German planners believed would limit Allied military capability. They had transformed complex manufacturing into mechanized processes that could be scaled rapidly with minimally trained workers. They had demonstrated organizational competence that belied propaganda claims about democratic chaos and capitalist inefficiency. Most troubling was the realization that this was not a temporary phenomenon that might be disrupted through military action or resource denial. The factories were located deep in the American interior, beyond the range of any German bomber and protected by geography that made sabotage nearly impossible. The workforce was voluntary, motivated, and growing rather than shrinking. The supply chains drew from resources across an entire continent, immune to the submarine warfare that might interdict seaborne imports. American industrial mobilization was effectively invulnerable to German countermeasures. Reinhardt drafted what he intended as his final comprehensive assessment, a document that abandoned diplomatic language and stated conclusions with uncomfortable directness. Germany could not win a production war against the United States. Current military strategies premised on achieving favorable tactical exchange rates were mathematically impossible given the production disparities. The longer the war continued, the more overwhelming Allied material advantages would become. The only rational strategic option was negotiation for terms before the full weight of American production capacity made Germany's position completely untenable. He never sent that report. On April 3, FBI agents arrested him at his boarding house based on information from a Swiss intelligence contact who had been working for American counterintelligence. His cover identity collapsed under professional interrogation that revealed American intelligence capabilities he had badly underestimated. Within days, he was in federal custody facing espionage charges that carried the death penalty. The irony did not escape him. He had spent months documenting American industrial supremacy, sending reports that Berlin apparently dismissed as exaggeration or deception. Now, captured and facing execution, he possessed information that might help his homeland, understanding of American capabilities that could inform more realistic strategic planning, but no means to communicate this knowledge to people who probably wouldn't believe it anyway. During his interrogation, American intelligence officers were remarkably well informed about German production capabilities and strategic assumptions. They knew what Berlin believed about Willow Run, understood why German leadership dismissed American production claims, and found this skepticism useful for maintaining operational surprise. "Let them believe their propaganda," one interrogator said. "Let them think we're incompetent until the bombers darken their skies. Reality makes a more effective weapon than any secret we could protect." Reinhardt was held at a federal facility in Illinois, his espionage case prosecuted with efficiency that demonstrated American organizational capability extended well beyond manufacturing. His trial received minimal publicity, the government preferring not to draw attention to intelligence failures that had allowed a German agent to operate undetected for months. He was convicted on multiple espionage counts and sentenced to 30 years in federal prison, a term that likely meant he would die in American custody given his age and health conditions that would deteriorate in captivity. In his cell at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, Reinhardt followed news of the war through carefully censored newspapers and radio broadcasts. Each report of Allied air operations confirmed his assessments. American bomber formations grew larger month by month. Luftwaffe defenses, initially effective, became overwhelmed by numerical superiority that rendered individual skill and tactical excellence strategically inadequate. By late 1943, the 8th Air Force was launching raids with 500 aircraft or more, fleets that would have been impossible without the production miracles he had documented at Willow Run and similar facilities. He learned through prison communications that Germany had attempted to match American production through their own organizational reforms and efficiency initiatives. These efforts achieved modest improvements but could not overcome fundamental constraints. Germany lacked America's vast natural resources, geographic security, and population base. German industry operated under constant threat of Allied bombing while American factories expanded in complete safety. German workforce was depleting as men were conscripted for military service while America drew on previously underutilized labor including women and minorities. The strategic situation he had predicted in his unsent final report materialized exactly as his analysis had concluded. By 1944, German forces faced overwhelming material disadvantages across all theaters. The Normandy invasion succeeded partly because Allied air superiority, built on American production capacity, prevented effective German response. The Eastern Front devoured German equipment faster than factories could replace losses while Soviet forces increasingly employed American-supplied trucks, aircraft, and weapons provided through Lend-Lease programs. In Italy, North Africa, and the Pacific, American material superiority ground down enemy resistance through simple attrition. Reinhardt understood with perfect clarity that he had witnessed the exact moment when industrial capacity became the decisive factor in modern warfare, when the old verities about national character and martial spirit gave way to brutal mathematics of production rates and resource availability. The factory in Michigan had demonstrated a truth that German leadership could not accept until far too late. Wars between industrial nations would be won not on battlefields but in factories, not through superior tactics but through superior output, not by warriors but by workers. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.